Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel. Tonight, we'll explore one of the most important, yet often overlooked parts of history, the Silk Road, a vast network that linked empires, deserts, and oceans. Along these routes, silk and spices traveled, but so did stories of magic, new religions, strange technologies, and groundbreaking ideas that would change the course of civilizations. The name alone feels almost like a spell. It calls to mind caravans swaying across desert sands, cities glittering like jewels, and treasures that could reshape the world. If you enjoy these quiet explorations, I invite you to like and subscribe, or simply share a thought in the comments below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, all you need to do is rest. Get comfortable and allow your thoughts to soften. Let's begin. The Silk Road was never just one road. The phrase Silk Road conjures the image of a single winding path stretching across deserts and mountains. In reality, it was never a single road at all, but a vast web of interconnected routes. Traders could choose northern paths across the steppes, southern trails hugging the edges of deserts, or maritime routes across the Indian Ocean. Like a river with countless branches, it shifted with politics, weather, and the rise and fall of cities. One year, merchants might pass through Samarkand. A decade later, they might favor Kashgar or detour through Persia. This flexibility meant the Silk Road was always alive, always adapting, always moving. What united it all was not geography, but the human desire to connect, to exchange goods, yes, but also to swap stories, songs, and secrets. The Silk Road was less a place on a map and more a living system of exchange that spanned half the known world. Traders once crossed deserts where bones marked the path. Imagine walking into a desert where the horizon shimmers with heat and the only landmarks are bones. This was the grim reality for some who traveled the Silk Road's harshest routes. The Taklamakan Desert in particular was so vast and deadly, it earned the name the Desert of Death. Sandstorms could bury entire caravans, leaving behind nothing but bones and fragments of cloth to guide the next travelers. Camels, though perfectly adapted, sometimes collapsed under the weight of their burdens. People carried just enough water to reach the next oasis, hoping not to misjudge the distance. And yet, despite the dangers, merchants braved these passages for the promise of wealth. The very existence of such routes shows the staggering risks people took to connect worlds. To stand on those sands today is to feel the echoes of countless lives who gambled everything for the dream of trade. Silk was so precious it was treated like currency. When the Silk Road first blossomed, silk was more than a luxury, it was wealth itself. In Rome, senators and nobles were astonished by the shimmering fabric that seemed to glow with light. It was so rare that an ounce of silk could be worth more than an ounce of gold. In parts of Central Asia, bolts of silk served as literal currency, exchanged for horses, spices, and even loyalty. Soldiers were sometimes paid in silk, knowing that anywhere along the caravan routes it could be traded for essentials. Its allure came not only from beauty, but also mystery. For centuries, no one outside China knew how it was made. The secrecy of its creation turned silk into something magical, a fabric that seemed almost otherworldly. For centuries, it remained the most coveted product moving across the old world, weaving together the fate of empires. Chinese emperors tried to keep silk making a secret. The knowledge of silk production was among the most closely guarded secrets in ancient China. According to legend, emperors decreed that anyone who revealed the secret of the silkworm could face execution. For centuries, the process of raising mulberry trees, cultivating silkworms, and unraveling their cocoons was hidden behind palace walls and guarded by imperial decree. Envoys and spies from Persia, India, and Rome tried desperately to learn the mystery, but failed. Eventually, monks are said to have smuggled silkworm eggs out of China, hidden inside hollow bamboo staffs, bringing the knowledge west to Byzantium. Yet for hundreds of years, China alone held the monopoly, enriching its dynasties and dazzling its neighbors. That fierce protection of silk's secret is part of why the Silk Road existed at all, because as long as no one else could make it, the world had no choice but to seek it out. Roman senators wore silk, even though they condemned it. In Rome, silk caused both wonder and controversy. Senators draped themselves in shimmering robes that caught the light like liquid, but moralists raged against what they saw as decadence. Writers like Seneca criticized silk as weakening Roman virtue, claiming the transparent garments corrupted women and softened men. The Senate even tried to ban silk at one point, fearing it drained Rome's wealth as gold flowed eastward in exchange for the coveted fabric. And yet, the more they condemned it, the more irresistible it became. The shimmering threads whispered of distant lands, exotic luxuries, and a world beyond Rome's borders. Wealthy citizens flaunted it at festivals and banquets, and soon it became an unmistakable symbol of status. The contradictions of silk in Rome, condemned in speeches, celebrated in practice, show just how powerfully the Silk Road reshaped even the proudest of empires. The Silk Road carried ideas as well as goods. The caravans of the Silk Road carried bolts of silk, sacks of spices, and bars of silver, but more importantly, they carried thoughts. A merchant might trade textiles in Kashgar, and hear a story from India. A Buddhist monk might bring teachings from one kingdom to another. An artisan might learn new patterns by seeing foreign art. Alongside tangible goods traveled philosophy, technology, music, and myths. Paper and printing techniques slowly moved westward, while glassmaking and medicine drifted eastward. The Silk Road was, in essence, the internet of the ancient world, a channel where cultures encountered one another, sometimes clashing, sometimes blending. The result was a richer, more interconnected humanity, where no civilization remained fully isolated. Every religion, every language, every science we know today carries faint traces of this great mingling. Buddhism spread across Asia along caravan routes. The serene images of the Buddha carved into cave walls at Dunhuang or painted in monasteries across Central Asia remind us of how faith itself traveled the Silk Road. Monks walked with caravans, carrying scrolls and relics to new lands. In bustling oases, merchants paused to visit monasteries, donate wealth, and hear the Dharma. Entire temples rose along the trade routes, funded by the generosity of traders grateful for safe passage. Over time, Buddhism journeyed from India into Central Asia, into China, and eventually as far as Korea and Japan, carried not by conquest, but by conversation and exchange. The blending of cultures left its mark on art. Buddhas carved in Central Asia sometimes bear Greco-Roman features, evidence of artistic styles mingling along the way. The Silk Road was not only a path of material riches, but also of spiritual transformation. Diseases traveled the Silk Road, including the Black Death. The Silk Road carried wealth and wisdom, but it also carried something darker. Germs moved with caravans as silently as spices and silks. The most infamous example is the Black Death. In the 14th century, plague spread from Asia to Europe, decimating populations along the routes. Fleas hiding on rats, or even on the clothing of travelers, helped carry the disease from town to town. But this was not the only illness to travel these parts. Smallpox, measles, and other epidemics rode the caravans, shaping the fate of entire civilizations. The Silk Road reminds us that connection always comes with risks, but the same roads that carry beauty can also carry death. Yet even this dark legacy is part of its history, showing how deeply interwoven human societies had become by the time of the Middle Ages. Marco Polo's tales sparked Europe's obsession with the East. When Marco Polo returned to Venice after years in the service of Kublai Khan, his stories electrified Europe. He spoke of cities larger than any in Europe, of palaces roofed with gold, of paper money, coal fires, and marvels no Venetian had ever imagined. Some thought his tales were exaggerations, even fantasies. But his book, The Travels of Marco Polo, spread quickly and fueled dreams of reaching Asia directly. Christopher Columbus would later carry a copy on his voyage westward. Whether Polo embellished or not, his descriptions captured the magic of the Silk Road, a place where wealth, mystery, and possibility seemed endless. In many ways, his tales were less about geography and more about imagination, giving Europeans a new hunger for contact with the East. Paper making traveled westward on the Silk Road. Few inventions changed the world as profoundly as paper, and its journey westward was made possible by the Silk Road. First developed in China during the Han Dynasty, paper slowly began its long trek across Asia. In the 8th century, after the Battle of Talas, captured Chinese artisans revealed its secrets to the Islamic world. From there, paper mills appeared in Samarkand, then in Baghdad, and eventually across the Mediterranean into Europe. Without the Silk Road, the spread of paper, and by extension, the birth of widespread literacy and the printing revolution, might have been delayed by centuries. Imagine how different the world might be if books, newspapers, and even the notes we write today had been postponed. The humble sheets we now take for granted began as guarded secrets, traded and transmitted across the same roads as silk and spice. Gunpowder secrets slowly moved along the routes. Gunpowder, one of the most world-changing inventions, was first created in China during the Tang Dynasty. At first, it was used for fireworks, religious ceremonies, and frightening evil spirits with loud explosions. But soon, military innovators realized its terrifying potential. Knowledge of its formula, sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter, spread cautiously westward, whispered through travelers and scholars who passed along the Silk Road. By the 13th century, it reached the Islamic world, where it was refined and adapted for use in cannons. From there, the technology leapt into Europe, transforming medieval warfare forever. Castles that once stood impregnable crumbled under bombardment, and knights in shining armor became obsolete. The slow trickle of this knowledge across the Silk Road is a reminder of how ideas, even dangerous ones, cannot be contained. A discovery born in one corner of the world soon reshaped the destinies of kingdoms oceans away. The compass reached the west through these networks. The magnetic compass, another Chinese invention, made its way westward thanks to Silk Road exchange. Early Chinese navigators used lodestones, naturally magnetic rocks, to orient themselves, long before Europeans ever conceived of such a tool. The concept traveled west along caravan trails and seaborne routes, reaching the Islamic world and eventually Europe. By the 12th century, compasses were guiding sailors through the Mediterranean. This simple device, a floating needle pointing north, became one of the keys to the age of exploration. Without the compass, Columbus and Vasco da Gama might never have risked their daring voyages across the seas. It is humbling to think that an invention first used to harmonize buildings with the principles of feng shui would one day steer ships into the unknown oceans, opening the globe to contact and conquest. All thanks to the great chain of communication that was the Silk Road. Nomadic peoples were the gatekeepers of trade. Behind the glittering goods of the Silk Road stood nomadic peoples who controlled the steppes and deserts. Scythians, Turks, Mongols, and countless other tribes moved with the seasons, herding their animals across vast ranges. To merchants, these nomads could be either protectors or predators. They demanded tribute, provided horses, and guided caravans across landscapes no outsider could navigate alone. They also carried news, gossip, and innovations between empires. Many rulers learned that peace with nomads was essential if they wanted trade to flow. Entire dynasties rose to power by mastering the art of living between civilizations, extracting wealth from the goods passing through their lands. Without these nomadic intermediaries, the Silk Road might never have functioned at all. They were the unseen weavers of the web, feared, respected, and indispensable to the ancient world's greatest highway. Camels were the ships of the desert. No creature is more closely tied to the Silk Road than the camel. With their double rows of eyelashes, thick lips, and ability to store fat in their humps, they were perfectly adapted for desert travel. A well-provisioned camel could walk for days without water, carrying hundreds of pounds on its back. Merchants sometimes moved in caravans of several hundred camels, each laden with silk, spices, or porcelain. Their slow, swaying gait became the rhythm of desert trade, their bells ringing softly across endless dunes. Without camels, many Silk Road routes, particularly across the Gobi and Taklamakan deserts, would have been impossible. To the people who relied on them, camels were wealth, transport, and survival rolled into one. They were truly the ships of the desert, sailing seas of sand where no other beast could endure. Oases became glittering trade cities. In the middle of vast deserts, oases appeared like miracles. These patches of green, fed by underground springs or rivers, became lifelines for weary travelers. Yet they were more than watering holes. Over centuries, oases blossomed into cities buzzing with markets, temples, and caravanserais. Turpan, Dunhuang, Kashgar, and Merv thrived as resting points along the Silk Road, their streets filled with traders speaking dozens of languages. A merchant could buy Arabian frankincense, Indian spices, Chinese silk, and Central Asian horses, all within a single marketplace. These cities became cultural melting pots, where architecture blended styles, cuisines fused, and new religions took root. At night, torchlight flickered on silk canopies, while storytellers entertained traders fresh from the sands. Without these glittering oases, the Silk Road would have been a chain of perilous voids. With them, it became a constellation of jewels scattered across Asia's deserts. Kashgar was called the pivot of Asia. At the western edge of China, where mountain ranges and deserts converge, lies Kashgar, a city once called the pivot of Asia. Traders from India, Persia, China, and the steppes all funneled through its crowded bazaars. Its location made it a crossroads where northern and southern Silk Road routes intersected, and thus a place of immense strategic importance. For centuries, empires vied to control it, knowing that whoever held Kashgar could command the flow of trade. Its market brimmed with spices, jade, and fine textiles. While outside the city, travelers prepared for the long trek through the treacherous Taklamakan Desert or the passes of the Pamirs. Even today, Kashgar retains echoes of its glory, with narrow lanes, ancient mosques, and vibrant bazaars that still feel like fragments of a world where East and West embraced in commerce and conversation. Samarkand was once the richest city on earth. Few places capture the romance of the Silk Road like Samarkand. Nestled in modern-day Uzbekistan, it was once famed as the richest city in the world. Under the rule of Timur Tamerlane in the 14th century, it dazzled visitors with shimmering blue-tiled mosques, bustling markets, and gardens filled with exotic plants. Merchants marveled at its wealth, scholars gathered in its libraries, and artisans filled its workshops with treasures. Samarkand was not only a hub for goods, but also for knowledge, astronomy, and poetry. To walk its streets was to hear Persian verses, Turkish songs, and Chinese merchants bargaining all in one place. Its Registan Square still stands today, an architectural jewel of turquoise domes and intricate mosaics, echoing the days when Samarkand was the beating heart of the Silk Road and a city whose brilliance seemed almost otherworldly. Caravanserais were the motels of the Silk Road. Imagine traveling for weeks across endless sands, only to see stone walls rise from the horizon. These were caravanserais, fortified inns built along trade routes to shelter merchants and their animals. Inside, weary travelers found water, food, and safety from bandits. Some caravanserais were simple courtyards, while others were architectural marvels with domed halls and stables large enough for hundreds of camels. They were places where cultures mingled. Persian traders shared tales with Chinese merchants, while nomads sold horses to passing caravans. Caravanserais became centers of exchange, not just of goods, but of languages and ideas. They dotted the Silk Road like pearls on a string, offering rare comfort in a perilous world. For many merchants, these inns were the difference between survival and ruin, the promise of rest in a journey measured not in days but in months. Spices like cinnamon and pepper were worth their weight in gold. To us today, spices like cinnamon, pepper, and cloves are common, tucked into kitchens worldwide. But on the Silk Road, these flavors were rarities so precious they were measured against gold. A handful of black peppercorns might buy a sheep. A sack of cinnamon could pay for a servant's wages for a year. The allure was not only taste, but also mystery. Where did these treasures come from? Many traders cloaked their origins in fantastical stories, claiming cinnamon grew in nests guarded by giant birds, or that pepper was harvested from snake-infested valleys. Spices transformed cooking, medicine, and even ritual in lands far from their origin. They became the jewels of the pantry, proof that the Silk Road connected kitchens as much as kingdoms. To sprinkle pepper on a Roman feast was to taste the distant lands of India and beyond. Jade from Central Asia flowed into imperial China. Long before silk crossed deserts, jade was already traveling along early trade routes. Chinese emperors treasured jade above gold, calling it the stone of heaven. Smooth, translucent, and shimmering with shades of green and white, jade symbolized purity, immortality, and power. Yet the finest nephrite jade was not found in China's heartland, but in Central Asia. Traders risked desert crossings to bring blocks of jade from places like Khotan, where rivers washed the stones down from distant mountains. This jade was carved into ornaments, ceremonial weapons, and burial suits for China's elite. Demand was so high that jade routes became some of the earliest arteries of what would later be called the Silk Road. The exchange of jade reminds us that long before caravans carried bolts of silk, humanity's hunger for beauty and symbolism was already binding worlds together. Glassware from Rome reached the palaces of China. If Chinese silk dazzled Rome, Roman glass astonished China. Roman artisans perfected techniques to create clear, delicate glass vessels, bowls, goblets, and flasks that seemed almost magical to those accustomed to pottery or bronze. These fragile treasures traveled thousands of miles, packed carefully into caravans and exchanged for silk, jade, or spices. In China, they were prized as exotic wonders, sometimes placed in royal tombs as symbols of prestige. For archaeologists today, shards of Roman glass found in Chinese sites are powerful proof of how far goods traveled along the Silk Road. Imagine holding a goblet made in Rome that once gleamed on a table in Chang'an, an object that crossed continents, deserts, and languages to find a second life in a palace half a world away. These fragile vessels are silent witnesses to the daring journeys of ancient trade. China sent golden peaches and rare horses westward. While silk is the road's namesake, China exported far more than fabric. Among the most exotic gifts were golden peaches and heavenly horses. Chinese emperors cultivated rare fruits and sent them west as symbols of abundance and power. Even more coveted were the blood-sweating horses of Fergana, said to descend from divine stock. These powerful animals were unlike anything bred in China, and acquiring them became a royal obsession. Wars were even fought over their possession, and caravans carrying these horses were treated with reverence. Alongside porcelain and lacquerware, such unusual exports showed how the Silk Road was not only about trade, but also about diplomacy. Gifts of fruit and animals demonstrated prestige and established alliances. To receive a Chinese peach or a heavenly horse was to hold proof of connection to the heart of the world's greatest empire. The Silk Road inspired tales of hidden kingdoms. Wandering merchants did more than sell goods, they told stories. Travelers described kingdoms of gold, cities of endless wealth, and hidden lands filled with marvels. Some tales may have been exaggerations, while others grew from real places glimpsed through rumor. The fabled kingdom of Prester John, for example, emerged from whispers of Christian enclaves in Asia. Myths of distant lands seeped into European imaginations, fueling quests and pilgrimages. For those who had never left their villages, these stories made the Silk Road a place of legend, where fortune and fantasy mingled. Just as fairy tales cross cultures, these Silk Road myths traveled as easily as silk or spice, shaping how people imagined the wider world. In many ways, the Silk Road became not just a highway of goods, but a highway of wonder. Tang Dynasty Chang'an was the starting point of the Silk Road. In China, the bustling city of Chang'an, today's Xi'an, served as the eastern anchor of the Silk Road during the Tang Dynasty. Its markets overflowed with traders from across Asia, filling the streets with a swirl of languages, scents, and colors. Foreign merchants lived in dedicated quarters, bringing with them fashions, foods, and faiths from distant lands. For Tang emperors, Chang'an was both a capital and a showcase of global exchange. Here, caravans were outfitted for the long journey west, carrying silk, porcelain, and precious metals into the deserts. Chang'an's grandeur left visitors awestruck. Wide boulevards, towering gates, and sprawling palaces demonstrated the wealth of the empire. To begin a Silk Road journey here was to step from the heart of one of history's most cosmopolitan cities into the vast unknown stretching across Asia. Xi'an's Great Mosque reflects centuries of crossroads faith. One of the most remarkable monuments in Xi'an is its Great Mosque, a testament to the Silk Road's religious diversity. Built during the Tang Dynasty, it reflects both Islamic faith and Chinese architectural traditions. Instead of domes and minarets, the mosque features sweeping roofs, courtyards, and wooden carvings reminiscent of Buddhist temples. This fusion embodies the cultural exchange of the Silk Road, where religions adapted and blended with local styles. The mosque remains one of the oldest and largest in China, a living reminder of how Islam reached East Asia through traders, envoys, and pilgrims. Standing in its quiet courtyards today, one can almost hear the echoes of merchants pausing from their journeys to pray, uniting their distant homelands with the bustling heart of China. The Great Mosque is not just a place of worship, but a monument to the Silk Road's spirit of coexistence. Coins from Rome have been found in China. Among the most striking archaeological discoveries along the Silk Road are Roman coins unearthed in China. These silver and bronze pieces stamped with the faces of emperors, testified to trade that spanned continents. Though no Roman legions marched into China, their currency traveled in the pockets of merchants, passed from hand to hand across deserts and mountains. Finding a Roman denarius in a Chinese tomb is like finding a text message from 2,000 years ago, evidence of connection across unimaginable distances. These coins reveal the global nature of the ancient world, reminding us that long before airplanes or the internet, humans found ways to link even the farthest civilizations. The Silk Road was not just a bridge between neighbors, but a thread that tied together the great powers of East and West. Silk Road trade helped shape early globalization. When we speak of globalization today, we think of airplanes, the internet, and container ships. But the Silk Road was an early form of globalization, a system where distant economies became interdependent. Chinese silk influenced Roman fashion. Persian glass reshaped Chinese art. Indian spices transformed European cuisine. Knowledge flowed in both directions, creating a shared human experience that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. This interconnectedness meant that no empire could truly remain isolated events in one part of the world, rippled across the entire network. A drought in Central Asia might drive nomads to raid caravans, which in turn could disrupt markets in Baghdad or Venice. The Silk Road created the first fragile web of global interdependence, a precursor to the world we inhabit today. Genghis Khan's empire revived the roots. By the early 13th century, much of the Silk Road had fallen into decline, fractured by wars and banditry. Then came Genghis Khan and his Mongol Empire, whose conquests united vast swaths of Asia under one rule. Brutal though the campaigns were, the result was an unprecedented era of safety for merchants. The Mongols valued trade, seeing it as a source of wealth and stability for their empire. They offered protection to caravans, established postal relay stations, and encouraged foreign merchants to travel. Under Mongol rule, the Silk Road came alive again, bustling with goods and envoys from one end of Eurasia to the other. It was during this Pax Mongolica that travelers like Marco Polo could make their extraordinary journeys. Genghis Khan, conqueror though he was, inadvertently became one of the greatest patrons of global trade. The Mongol Pax Mongolica made the road safer than ever. The phrase Pax Mongolica means Mongol peace, and it refers to the remarkable stability that followed the Mongol conquests. Despite their reputation as fearsome warriors, the Mongols enforced strict laws along their routes, making travel safer than it had been in centuries. Bandits who once preyed on caravans were eliminated or driven underground. Relay stations stocked with food and fresh horses allowed envoys to travel quickly across vast distances. Merchants began to move goods on a scale previously unimaginable, confident they would arrive intact. The effects rippled outward. Venetian traders gained easier access to Asian luxuries, while Chinese goods flowed steadily into Persia and beyond. For a brief time in history, one empire stretched across nearly the entire Silk Road, making it as close to a unified system as it had ever been. The Pax Mongolica was short-lived, but its impact was immense. Polo's journey wouldn't have been possible without Mongol rule. Marco Polo's legendary travels to the court of Kublai Khan were only possible because of the Mongols' control over the Silk Road. Without the relative safety of Pax Mongolica, the journey from Venice to China would have been nearly suicidal. The Mongols encouraged foreign visitors, granting them safe conduct passes and protection. Polo traveled through lands once considered impassable, across deserts, mountains, and steppes, guided by the infrastructure the Mongols established. His vivid descriptions of Chinese palaces, paper money, and bustling cities opened Europe's eyes to the wealth and sophistication of the East. But behind his story stands the silent power of Mongol governance, the roads, guards, and stability that allowed a Venetian family to walk across half the world. His travels became legendary, but they were also a product of the Mongol moment in history, when the Silk Road was at its safest. Persian rugs became icons of luxury along the way. Persian rugs are now admired worldwide for their intricate patterns and artistry. But long before they adorned European palaces or American homes, they were treasures of the Silk Road. Woven by skilled artisans in Persia, each rug was a tapestry of culture, with designs reflecting gardens, stars, and ancient myths. A single rug could take years to weave, its knots tied by hand with astonishing precision. Merchants rolled these carpets onto camels, carrying them across mountains and deserts to distant courts. In China, they became prized possessions, symbols of refinement and cosmopolitan taste. In the West, travelers marveled at their vivid colors and durability, realizing these were not mere floor coverings, but works of art. Their journey along the Silk Road helped establish them as global symbols of luxury. Even today, Persian rugs retain that aura of timelessness, each thread echoing centuries of cultural exchange. Indian cotton changed fashion across continents. While silk may have stolen the name of the trade routes, cotton was just as revolutionary. In India, cotton textiles were perfected with techniques of spinning and dyeing that produced cloth lighter, softer, and more breathable than wool or linen. Traders carried bolts of cotton along the Silk Road, and soon, entire wardrobes shifted. In desert regions, its lightness was a blessing. In humid climates, it was a miracle. Europeans eventually became so enamored with Indian cotton that by the early modern period, it dominated fashion markets. But this story began on the Silk Road, where merchants first introduced the fabric to distant lands. Cotton was not only practical but also beautiful, decorated with block prints, embroidery, and dazzling dyes. Its spread reshaped economies, clothing, and even agriculture as more and more regions began to cultivate the plant. Cotton was, in many ways, the quiet rival of silk. Amber from the Baltic reached China. Amber, fossilized tree resin, glowing like captured sunlight, traveled thousands of miles from the cold shores of the Baltic Sea to reach the courts of China. For the Chinese elite, amber was mysterious, warm to the touch, and often carved into beads, amulets, or figurines. Along the Silk Road, it was believed to have protective powers, guarding against evil spirits and illness. Imagine a tiny stone that once lay buried in northern forests, finding its way into the jewelry box of a noble in Chang'an. Its journey reflects the sheer scope of the Silk Road, not only east-west but north-south, connecting forests, deserts, and seas. Archaeologists have found amber beads in tombs deep in Asia, silent proof of these incredible exchanges. The Amber Road, as it was sometimes called, shows how even humble natural materials became links in the chain of global connection. Silver from Japan found its way to the Middle East. While silk and spices flowed west, silver often traveled east. Japan's mines were among the richest in the pre-modern world, producing massive quantities of silver that moved along both land and maritime routes. This silver became essential currency in Silk Road trade, used to purchase Chinese silk, porcelain, and other luxuries. From there, it traveled onward, reaching Persia and the Middle East. In markets from Samarkand to Baghdad, Japanese silver coins may have changed hands alongside Roman glass or Indian spices. Its presence reveals how far-flung and interconnected the Silk Road truly was. A piece of silver minted in Japan might end up in a Persian merchant's chest or melted into jewelry for a wealthy buyer in the Ottoman Empire. These journeys highlight the invisible commodities of the Silk Road, not just treasures for kings, but the metals that fueled commerce itself. Caravan bells once rang across endless steppe. The soundscape of the Silk Road was unlike anything today. Caravans of camels and horses carried bells, not for decoration, but for coordination. As the animals walked in long, winding lines, the bells jingled softly, helping keep pace and allowing merchants to trek one another in the dust or darkness. To a weary traveler, the sound of caravan bells meant safety, proof that companions were near. Across the empty steppe or the silent desert, the ringing was a kind of music, blending with the wind and the footsteps of animals. These bells became symbols of travel and trade, reminders that wealth was on the move. Even today, in parts of Central Asia, similar bells are still used, though sound a faint echo of the thousands of journeys that once tied together empires. The Silk Road was not silent. It sang with the bells of caravans. Traders carried salt as a precious commodity. Salt seems ordinary now, but on the Silk Road, it was a treasure. Essential for preserving food, maintaining health, and flavoring meals, salt was often worth as much as silver. Caravans carried heavy loads of salt across deserts, especially from Central Asian mines, to markets where demand never faltered. In some regions, salt bricks were even used as currency. To nomads and city dwellers alike, salt meant survival. It preserved meat during long winters, enabled long-distance journeys, and added taste to otherwise plain diets. Control of salt routes often meant political power. Rulers taxed it heavily, and wars sometimes broke out over access to salt supplies. The salt trade shows how the Silk Road wasn't only about luxuries for the wealthy. It was also about the humble but essential commodities that sustained life, shaping empires and economies just as powerfully as silk or spice. Horses were bred and sold like treasure. Among all the goods exchanged on the Silk Road, few were as highly prized as horses. Strong, fast, and enduring, horses were the engines of empires. They carried armies to victory, pulled caravans, and served as symbols of prestige. Breeding programs in Central Asia produced some of the finest mants in the world, and these animals fetched staggering prices in distant markets. Chinese dynasties, in particular, coveted Central Asian horses, sometimes paying in silk or even launching military campaigns to secure them. Horses weren't just animals. They were strategic assets. Their movement along the Silk Road shows how the network was not only about luxury, but also about military might. In a sense, every empire's fate rested partly on the hooves of these creatures, whose power and beauty made them treasures as valuable as any jewel or fabric. China's heavenly horses came from Central Asia. The Chinese called them heavenly horses, and they were unlike anything bred within the empire. Originating in the Fergana Valley, these animals were larger, stronger, and swifter than local breeds, with arched necks and impressive stamina. Legends claimed they sweated blood, likely from a skin parasite that caused reddish marks during exertion. The Han dynasty desired them so fiercely that they launched military expeditions to obtain them. These horses became vital for cavalry forces and prestigious gifts between rulers. To own a heavenly horse was to command respect. Their fame spread so widely that they became symbols of divine favor and imperial strength. The trade in these horses underscores how the Silk Road was not simply about commerce, but also about geopolitics, with entire wars waged over the right to breed and own them. They remain one of the Silk Road's most legendary commodities. Music merged east and west in caravan camps. On the Silk Road, music was as much a traveler as silk or spice. In caravan camps, merchants gathered around fires and shared songs from their homelands. Instruments traveled with them. The Persian oud influenced the Chinese pipa, while Central Asian lutes inspired variations that spread into Europe. Rhythms and melodies blended. giving rise to entirely new styles. Imagine a camp at dusk, the crackle of fire, the smell of roasting meat, and the sound of flutes, drums, and strings weaving together stories from across continents. Music eased loneliness, entertained weary traders, and became a universal language in a world of many tongues. Some of the instruments we take for granted today, including the guitar's ancestors, owe their spread to these minglings of music along the Silk Road. It was not only goods that were exchanged, but also the very songs of humanity. Persian poetry found readers in China. Persian poets like Rumi, Ferdowsi, and Hafiz are celebrated worldwide today, but their words also traveled along the Silk Road centuries ago. Manuscripts, storytellers, and scholars carried their verses eastward, where Persian literature gained admirers in Central Asia and even China. The imagery of gardens, stars, and love found echoes in Chinese poetry, blending with local traditions. In turn, Chinese aesthetics influenced Persian miniatures and calligraphy, creating a cycle of artistic dialogue. The Silk Road became a literary bridge, proving that beauty speaks across languages. Imagine a Chinese scholar in a Tang dynasty courtyard unrolling a manuscript of Persian verse, words written thousands of miles away, now shaping new imaginations. The blending of poetic traditions is one of the most delicate yet profound legacies of the Silk Road, a reminder that art, like trade, thrives on connection. Chinese porcelain became the most desired tableware in Europe. When Europeans first encountered Chinese porcelain, they were astonished. Here was tableware that was light, translucent, and yet far stronger than anything produced in Europe. Its glossy glaze and delicate artistry made it seem almost magical. Porcelain traveled the Silk Road in crates, carefully cushioned to prevent breakage. In Persia and the Middle East, it was treasured, often imitated by local artisans. By the time it reached Europe, porcelain became so desirable that it was nicknamed white gold. Wealthy families displayed it not only as dinnerware, but also as symbols of sophistication. Entire industries in Europe later developed just to try to replicate the Chinese secret, leading to the rise of famous porcelain centers like Meissen. The spread of porcelain shows how a single innovation could reshape aesthetics and industries across continents. To hold a porcelain cup was to hold the Silk Road in your hands. Glass mirrors reached China through the Silk Road. Before mirrors were common, reflections were caught in polished bronze, silver, or even water. When glass mirrors from the Roman world and later Byzantine artisans reached China, they were considered extraordinary novelties. Imagine the amazement of a person seeing their face reflected with perfect clarity for the first time. These fragile treasures traveled carefully wrapped, traded for silk, jade, or spices. Chinese craftsmen eventually began making their own glass mirrors, blending the imported techniques with local artistry. Archaeologists have discovered Roman-style mirrors in Chinese tombs, proof of their rarity and value. The arrival of such items reminds us how the Silk Road carried not only practical goods, but also wonders that altered daily life and perception. To gaze at oneself in glass for the first time was more than vanity. It was a small revolution in how humans understood their own image. Silk Road knowledge transformed medieval medicine. Alongside spices and silks, the Silk Road carried medical knowledge that reshaped healing across continents. Texts from India, Persia, China, and Greece were translated, copied, and passed between scholars. Chinese herbal remedies reached the Middle East, while Greco-Roman medical theory flowed into Asia. In bustling cities like Baghdad, scholars compiled massive encyclopedias of medicine, blending knowledge from every corner of the known world. Treatments for fevers, methods of surgery, and even ideas of anatomy traveled these routes. The impact was profound. European medicine during the Renaissance relied heavily on works that owed their existence to Silk Road exchanges. The movement of ideas shows that the Silk Road was not only about material luxury, but also about saving lives. Each bandaged wound or healed illness carried within it the invisible legacy of thousands of miles of exchange. The word caravan comes from the Persian karwan. Even our language carries the imprint of the Silk Road. The word caravan, describing groups of travelers journeying together for safety, comes from the Persian karwan. A caravan could include dozens or even hundreds of camels, merchants, guards, and servants, forming a small mobile community. They moved together across dangerous terrain, sharing resources and protecting one another from bandits. The very concept became central to Silk Road trade. Survival depended on it. From Persia, the word spread into Arabic, Turkish, and eventually European languages, carried just like the caravans themselves. Today, the word evokes romance and adventure, a line of camels disappearing into the horizon. But behind the poetry lies practicality. Caravans were the backbone of commerce, and without them, goods could never have moved safely across the vast distances that the Silk Road demanded. Traders measured distances by days, not miles. On the Silk Road, the concept of distance was very different from our modern maps. Merchants didn't speak of miles or kilometers. They measured journeys in days. One might say, it is 5 days to the next oasis, or 10 days to Samarkand. The measure depended on terrain, weather, and the stamina of camels or horses. A single storm could turn a 5-day trip into a 2-week ordeal. This way of reckoning distance reflected the uncertainties of travel. Maps, when they existed, were often more like lists of stages than precise charts. To live in that world was to experience geography as time itself. Survival meant pacing water, food, and energy to match the days of travel. The phrase "day's journey" captures the rhythm of life on the Silk Road, where distance was always experienced in the steady steps of beasts across vast landscapes. Some routes took years to complete. For modern travelers, crossing continents can take hours. For Silk Road merchants, the same journey might take years. A caravan setting out from China to reach Mediterranean ports could spend 2 or 3 years on the road, pausing for seasons, resting at oases, and waiting for safe passage through hostile territories. Goods often changed hands many times, passed from one merchant group to another in a chain of exchanges. Few traders ever traveled the entire length. Instead, journeys were broken into stages, each lasting months. Imagine dedicating years of your life to a single journey, knowing you might never return. Yet the rewards were worth the risks. Fortunes could be made on just one caravan. These immense timelines remind us of the dedication and courage behind the Silk Road. Every item traded carried with it not just distance, but years of human endeavor. The Silk Road was used by pilgrims as much as merchants. The Silk Road was not just a commercial highway, it was also a spiritual one. Pilgrims walked alongside merchants, traveling to holy sites scattered across Asia. Buddhists journeyed to India to visit sacred monasteries, Muslims made their way toward Mecca, and Christians sought distant churches and relics. These pilgrimages turned the Silk Road into a spiritual web, binding people of faith across continents. Pilgrims often traveled with caravans for protection, their devotion blending with the merchants' pursuit of profit. Along the way, monasteries, shrines, and temples rose, funded by donations from grateful travelers. These sacred sites became sanctuaries where weary pilgrims could rest, pray, and gather strength. In many cases, the movement of faith was just as significant as the movement of silk. The Silk Road was a path to salvation as much as it was a path to wealth. ancient monasteries offered food and shelter to travelers. For weary traders and pilgrims, monasteries along the Silk Road were havens of safety. Built in deserts, mountains, and towns, these religious institutions provided water, food, and shelter in exchange for donations or acts of devotion. Monasteries often grew wealthy from this role, accumulating goods from passing caravans. But they were also cultural centers, preserving manuscripts, copying texts, and spreading ideas. The famous Mogao caves near Dunhuang, for example, became filled with Buddhist art and scripture thanks to the steady stream of travelers. At night, flickering lamps illuminated frescoes of the Buddha, while traders rested in the safety of the monastery walls. These institutions were both spiritual and practical, showing how religion intertwined with commerce. They turned the Silk Road into not just a line of markets, but a line of sanctuaries, oases of the soul where weary wanderers found both rest and inspiration. Nestorian Christianity reached China along the routes. Though less well known than Buddhism or Islam, Christianity too traveled the Silk Road. Nestorian missionaries, branching from early Christian traditions in the Middle East, journeyed eastward with caravans, carrying crosses and scriptures. By the 7th century, Nestorian communities had established themselves in China, even gaining recognition from Tang emperors. Stone steels and inscriptions in Xi'an still testify to their presence, written in both Chinese and Syriac. These Christian communities adapted to local culture, blending elements of Chinese philosophy with their faith. Though eventually suppressed, their existence reveals the incredible diversity of religions carried by the Silk Road. The faith of a small sect in Mesopotamia could take root thousands of miles away, thanks to the determination of travelers who believed that every road was a path for their message. The Silk Road was a corridor not only for goods, but for God. Zoroastrian fire temples dotted the roads. Before Islam spread across Persia, Zoroastrianism was the dominant faith, and its fire temples dotted the lands traversed by Silk Road merchants. Traders passing through Persia or Central Asia might stop at these sacred sites, where eternal flames burned as symbols of purity and divinity. For Zoroastrians, fire represented truth and the presence of Ahura Mazda, their supreme god. These temples became familiar landmarks along the trade routes, offering travelers a glimpse into a faith that deeply influenced later religions. Some merchants may have prayed for safe passage, while others simply marveled at the rituals. Even after Zoroastrianism declined, echoes of its symbolism persisted, carried along by the Silk Road into new regions. The flames of these temples remind us that along with silk and spice, the roads carried the glow of belief, eternal fires linking distant peoples in shared awe of the divine. Arabic numerals traveled the Silk Road. The numbers we use every day, 1, 2, 3, have their roots in India. Known as Hindu-Arabic numerals, they traveled along the Silk Road, first moving into Persia and the Islamic world, and eventually reaching Europe. This simple system, with its place value and use of the digit 0, was far easier than the Roman numerals that had dominated Europe for centuries. The spread of these numerals transformed mathematics, commerce, and science. Merchants could keep clearer records, astronomers could chart the skies more precisely, and accountants could calculate profits with far greater ease. Every time we jot down a number, we are using the legacy of the Silk Road, a system of notation carried by scholars and traders across deserts and mountains, changing the very language of numbers forever. 0 came to Europe thanks to these exchanges. Perhaps the most radical number to travel the Silk Road was 0. Born in India as a symbol for nothingness, it journeyed through the Islamic world and into Europe. To ancient minds, 0 was more than a digit. It was a concept that challenged philosophy itself. How could nothing be something? Yet once adopted, zero became indispensable. It allowed for the development of algebra, calculus, and the complex mathematics that would later drive science, engineering, and navigation. The fact that this abstract idea traveled on the same routes as bolts of silk and sacks of spices is astonishing. A merchant's ledger with zeros was a revolutionary tool, enabling clear profit and loss calculations. Without zero, modern banking, astronomy, and even computers would be unthinkable. Its journey along the Silk Road shows how the smallest idea, a symbol of nothing, could become everything. Astrology spread across continents through trade. The Silk Road was not only a path for mathematics, but also for the stars. Astrologers in Mesopotamia mapped constellations and developed systems of prediction. These ideas traveled eastward, merging with Indian and Chinese traditions. In turn, Chinese observations of comets and eclipses fascinated scholars in the Islamic world. Along the road, star charts, instruments, and horoscopes changed hands, reshaping culture's understanding of the heavens. Astrology was more than entertainment. Rulers relied on it to make political decisions. Merchants consulted it for luck, and ordinary people sought meaning in the skies. The Silk Road blended cosmic traditions, creating a shared celestial heritage. Even today, echoes of these exchanges remain in the zodiac symbols and star lore that span continents. It is striking to realize that while camels carried spices across deserts, scholars were carrying constellations in their minds, connecting humanity under one vast starry sky. Persian miniature painting influenced Chinese art. Persian miniature painting is known for its jewel-like colors and intricate storytelling, and it too traveled the Silk Road. Scrolls, manuscripts, and artworks reached Central Asia and China, where artists marveled at the tiny, detailed worlds painted on a single page. Chinese art, in turn, influenced Persian works, with new motifs, brush techniques, and themes entering the mix. This cross-pollination enriched both traditions. In Persian manuscripts, dragons and phoenixes began to appear, clear evidence of Chinese inspiration. Meanwhile, Chinese artists adopted Persian approaches to narrative scenes, filling their scrolls with greater intricacy and drama. The Silk Road was thus not only about moving goods, but also about reshaping aesthetics. When we look at surviving artworks today, we see not only beauty, but also a record of centuries of conversation between cultures, a visual Silk Road written in pigment and brushstrokes. Chinese dragons appeared on Persian tiles. The dragon is one of China's most enduring symbols, a creature of power, wisdom, and good fortune. As silk and porcelain traveled westward, so did dragon imagery, leaping into Persian art. In Persia, artisans began to paint and carve dragons onto tiles, manuscripts, and ceramics. These dragons, however, blended Chinese curves with Persian flair, often appearing alongside Islamic calligraphy or geometric designs. The result was a new kind of dragon, born from cultural exchange. To see a Chinese dragon winding across Persian tiles is to witness the Silk Road's magic, symbols traveling, adapting, and taking on new lives in foreign lands. This blending of iconography shows that the Silk Road wasn't simply about goods, but also about imagination. Myths and symbols crossed borders as easily as spices, creating hybrid worlds of meaning that still astonish us today. The Silk Road helped shape the foods we eat today. The Silk Roads influence lives on every time we sit down for a meal. Ingredients, spices, and cooking methods flowed along its paths, transforming diets worldwide. Noodles from China inspired pasta in Italy. Spices from India revolutionized European cooking. Fruits, nuts, and teas found new homes thousands of miles from their origin. The fusion of flavors created entirely new cuisines. Persian rice dishes gained Chinese seasonings, Mediterranean stews incorporated Asian spices. Even today, our kitchens are echoes of those ancient exchanges. Imagine how bland European food once seemed before pepper and cinnamon arrived, or how tea, now a global staple, first reached distant lands along these routes. The Silk Road was, in a sense, humanity's first great culinary experiment, a never-ending banquet where every traveler brought something new to the table, reshaping what it meant to eat and to savor. Apricots spread from China to the Mediterranean. The sweet apricot, beloved in desserts and jams, has its origins in China. Along the Silk Road, traders carried dried apricots, seeds, and trees westward, planting them in orchards from Persia to the Mediterranean. Over time, they became staples of diets across Europe, celebrated for their golden color and tangy sweetness. Ancient Persians used them in sauces, while Arabs folded them into stews and sweets. In Europe, apricots became symbols of luxury and abundance. Their journey reminds us that even small, everyday fruits carry vast histories. Every bite of an apricot is a taste of ancient caravans, of orchards thriving in oasis towns, and of the Silk Road's invisible threads weaving agriculture into global patterns. The humble apricot, glowing like a sun in the palm, is a fruit that tells the story of worlds connected by trade. Grapes traveled eastward and became Chinese wine. Grapes, first cultivated in the Mediterranean and the Middle East, traveled eastward along the Silk Road. Caravans carried vines and seeds into Central Asia and beyond, where they eventually reached China. The Han Dynasty embraced grape wine, adding it to their already rich tradition of fermented drinks. Archaeological discoveries of ancient Chinese wine vessels show how quickly grapes became part of ritual and celebration. Yet these grapes were not just about drink. They symbolized status, novelty, and connection to far-off lands. The cultivation of vineyards in Western China marked a blending of agricultural traditions, linking Mediterranean viticulture with Chinese ingenuity. Today, vineyards still thrive in regions like Xinjiang, a living legacy of Silk Road exchanges. Each glass of wine from those soils is a reminder of the caravans that once carried bunches of grapes across deserts and mountains, turning fruit into global heritage. The peach once traveled from Persia into China. Though today peaches are associated with China, where they became symbols of immortality and longevity, their origins trace back to Persia. Traders carried peach seeds eastward, and once in China, the fruit took on an extraordinary cultural life. Chinese poets celebrated the peach as the fruit of the immortals, and artists painted heavenly peach orchards in their scrolls. Over time, China became so strongly associated with peaches that many forgot their foreign roots. This story is one of the Silk Road's paradoxes. Goods that began as imports could transform into icons of the importing culture. A Persian fruit became, in China, a symbol of eternity. The peach's journey is a reminder that even the most deeply rooted cultural symbols may, in fact, be travelers themselves, carrying the memory of caravans and the mingling of worlds in their sweet flesh. Pistachios and walnuts crossed into the east. Nuts were among the tastiest and most durable goods to travel the Silk Road. Pistachios from Persia and walnuts from Central Asia journeyed eastward, becoming prized delicacies in China. They were valued not only as food, but also as gifts for nobles and emperors. Their long shelf life made them perfect for caravan journeys, and their distinct flavors delighted palates unaccustomed to them. In China, pistachios came to be called the happy nut, their shells resembling smiling faces when split. Walnuts were woven into confections and medicine. These humble nuts carried with them centuries of cultivation and tradition, becoming global staples through their journeys. Each pistachio cracked open in China or each walnut eaten in a distant land was a small but tangible link in the great chain of exchange. Even the smallest smacks on the Silk Road tell stories of movement and wonder. Sugarcane moved from India across the world. Sugarcane was cultivated in India as early as the first millennium BCE, and along the Silk Road it began its long journey outward. From India, sugar knowledge spread to Persia, then to the Islamic world, and eventually into Europe. Before sugar, honey was the main sweetener in many regions. The arrival of sugar transformed cuisines, medicines, and even economies. Confectionery arts blossomed in Persia and the Arab world, while Europeans grew obsessed with this crystalline treasure. The spread of sugarcane was more than culinary. It laid the foundation for vast plantations and even reshaped world history centuries later during the colonial era. Yet it all began with traders carrying cane, seeds, and processing techniques along the Silk Road. Every spoonful of sugar in our kitchens today is, in a way, a memory of those ancient caravans spreading sweetness across the earth. Tea slowly made its way west. Tea, now the world's most consumed beverage after water, was born in China. At first it was used as a medicinal brew, a bitter tonic for health and focus. Over centuries, it evolved into a cultural centerpiece, with rituals and ceremonies elevating it to art. From China, bricks of compressed tea began their slow journey west along the Silk Road. In Tibet, tea blended with butter became a daily staple. In Central Asia, it became a comforting drink for weary travelers. Eventually, tea reached Persia and Russia, where it became embedded in daily life. Its ultimate arrival in Europe centuries later would spark revolutions of taste and trade, but the roots of its journey lay in Silk Road caravans carrying fragrant leaves across mountains. Each steaming cup of tea today is an echo of those long, winding roads and the leaves that compassed the world. Coffee came the other direction, toward the east. If tea traveled westward, coffee made its journey east. Originating in Ethiopia and cultivated in Yemen, coffee spread through the Islamic world as both a drink and a social ritual. Traders carried it across Persia and into Central Asia, where it mingled with tea-drinking traditions. In bustling caravanserais, merchants might sip both drinks, one from east, the other from west. Coffee houses soon sprang up in Persian and Ottoman cities, becoming centers of debate, poetry, and storytelling. By the time Europeans encountered coffee, it was already a Silk Road traveler, its bitter aroma filling the bazaars of the Middle East. The meeting of coffee and tea along the ancient routes highlights the Silk Road's role as the great table where the world's beverages met. Every cup of coffee enjoyed in Asia today is a descendant of beans once carried by merchants through desert sands. Even chili peppers eventually crossed these paths. Chili peppers, native to the Americas, did not exist on the ancient Silk Road at first. But after Columbus's voyages, they spread rapidly into Europe, Africa, and Asia, and from there, they joined the extended networks once shaped by the Silk Road. Within a few generations, they transformed cuisines worldwide. In China, chili peppers became essential to Sichuan cooking in India. They became staples of curries in Korea. They gave rise to kimchi's fiery flavor. Their spread shows how the Silk Road continued evolving even into the modern era, linking continents across both land and sea. The chili's fiery heat became a new kind of treasure, carried by merchants and embraced by cooks everywhere. Its global journey reminds us that the Silk Road was not frozen in time. It kept reinventing itself, carrying new wonders long after its classical age had passed. Carpets from Central Asia decorated palaces in China. Carpets woven in Central Asia became some of the most prized furnishings along the Silk Road. Made from wool dyed with natural pigments. Their rich patterns told stories of nomadic life, geometric traditions, and tribal identity. These carpets were rolled onto camels and carried east, where they found places of honor in Chinese palaces. To Chinese elites, these imported rugs were exotic luxuries, blending practicality with beauty. They softened stone floors, added warmth in cold seasons, and dazzled with colors unlike local weavings. Some were even used in temples, laid before shrines as offerings. For nomadic weavers, each carpet was both a practical item and a work of art for distant buyers. It became a prized status symbol. The carpets of Central Asia remind us that the Silk Road was also a road of textures, comfort, and the artistry of hands weaving across centuries. Gems from India ended up in Italian crowns. India's mines produced some of the most dazzling gems in the world: diamonds, sapphires, and rubies that gleamed like captured fire. Along the Silk Road, these stones traveled westward, traded for silk, silver, or horses. By the time they reached Europe, they were treasures fit for kings. Italian crowns and church reliquaries were studded with gems that had begun their journey in distant Indian soil. To wear one was to wear a fragment of the Silk Road, a connection to lands that seemed almost mythical. These jewels carried both beauty and power, symbols of wealth and divine favor. Each gem set in European regalia was not merely decoration, but also a silent witness to caravans, merchants, and countless hands that passed it along. Even the sparkle of a crown owes something to the endless journeys of the Silk Road. Exotic animals were traded along the roads. The Silk Road was not only about goods, but also about living creatures. Exotic animals became coveted symbols of power and curiosity. Caravans sometimes carried rare birds, trained monkeys, or even big cats as gifts between rulers. For a Chinese emperor to display a lion, or for a Persian king to marvel at an ostrich, was to show the reach of their influence. Animals traveled astonishing distances, often becoming legends in lands where they were unknown. These creatures fascinated audiences, inspired myths, and sometimes altered local zoology. The trade in animals shows the extraordinary range of the Silk Road, where even living, breathing wonders were part of the exchange. Every exotic beast displayed in an ancient court carried the memory of its long, perilous journey across deserts and mountains, reminders of the boundless curiosity and ambition of humankind. Ostriches were carried across Asia. Among the most surprising travelers on the Silk Road were ostriches. Native to Africa, these enormous birds were carried across Asia as exotic gifts. Their feathers, prized for decoration, adorned crowns, garments, and ceremonial objects. Their eggs, large and gleaming, were hollowed and used as vessels or painted as luxuries. For rulers in Persia or China, receiving an ostrich was proof of extraordinary connections, a bird that could not be found anywhere nearby, arriving alive from distant deserts. The transport of such massive creatures was no small feat. They had to be fed, guarded, and coaxed along journeys of thousands of miles. To see an ostrich striding through the courtyards of the Chinese palace would have been an astonishing sight, a living marvel brought by the Silk Road. It is a reminder that the road carried not just objects, but awe itself. Even lions appeared in imperial courts. Lions, long associated with strength and majesty, also found their way along the Silk Road. Native to parts of Asia and Africa, they were captured and transported as rare tributes for emperors and kings. In China, lions became symbols of power and protection, inspiring the creation of the iconic stone lion statues that still guard temples and palaces today. But the real animals, pacing in cages or displayed in royal menageries, were both terrifying and mesmerizing. Their presence in distant lands speaks to the lengths rulers went to in order to display their might. Each lion represented not only exotic power, but also the vast network of traders and hunters that made such a delivery possible. The roar of a lion in a Chinese court was more than a sound. It was the echo of the Silk Road, carrying wildness across continents. The Silk Road was a highway for stories. Beyond silks, spices, and treasures, the Silk Road carried tales. Merchants, pilgrims, and wanderers told stories around fires in caravanserais, and these tales traveled farther than any caravan. Myths of distant lands, stories of heroes and monsters, and fables of hidden kingdoms spread along the route, changing as they moved. Some of the world's most beloved folk tales, like those in the 1001 Nights, contain echoes of Silk Road storytelling. Storytellers were as important as merchants, carrying ideas that fed the imagination of whole civilizations. A child listening in Persia might grow up retelling a tale that had begun in India or China. These stories were not written on parchment, but carried in memory, traded as freely as spices. In the end, the Silk Road was as much a road of words as it was of goods, weaving humanity together with stories that still endure. Fairy tales like Aladdin have Silk Road roots. The story of Aladdin and his wonderful lamp, though most famously set in Arabian Nights, likely has roots in Silk Road storytelling. Traders and travelers swapped tales at caravanserais, where Persian, Indian, Chinese, and Arab story traditions mingled. A boy discovering a magical lamp, carpets that fly, and treasure-filled caves all reflect motifs from lands connected by trade. These tales carried echoes of distant markets, mysterious strangers, and the promise of hidden wealth, all themes born from Silk Road encounters. As stories passed from mouth to mouth, they adapted to new cultures, blending fantasy with familiar settings. By the time Aladdin was written down in the 18th century, it had become a fusion of traditions, embroidered with the wonder of centuries of travel. In this way, the Silk Road didn't just carry silk or spices, it carried dreams that became the fairy tales of the world. Languages borrowed words from each other along the way. The Silk Road was a highway of languages as much as goods. In its markets, dozens of tongues rang out: Chinese, Persian, Arabic, Turkic, Sanskrit, Greek, and more. Merchants often spoke several languages, switching mid-sentence to strike a deal. Inevitably, words slipped across borders. The English word sugar comes from Sanskrit shakara, carried westward by traders. Caravan comes from Persian. Even jasmine, orange, and lemon trace their origins to the mingling of languages on these routes. For centuries, words traveled alongside goods, carried on parchments, in songs, and in the speech of merchants bargaining over bolts of silk. These borrowed words are living fossils of the Silk Road, reminders that languages are never static. They are shaped by contact, trade, and curiosity. Every time we use them, we echo the ancient conversations that once echoed through desert markets and caravan camps. The road wove together dozens of civilizations. From Rome to China, from Persia to India, the Silk Road stitched together civilizations that might otherwise have remained strangers. A Roman merchant might sip Chinese tea. A Persian poet might write on Indian paper. A Chinese emperor might treasure a gem from Afghanistan. Each culture gave and received, reshaping itself in subtle ways. The road was not dominated by a single empire, but rather woven from dozens of threads. Nomadic tribes, great dynasties, bustling cities, and tiny oases. Together, they formed the first global tapestry of human connection. Archaeological digs reveal this interconnectedness. Roman coins in China, Chinese silk in Egyptian tombs, Indian ivory in Mesopotamian palaces. The Silk Road's magic was not that it belonged to one people, but that it belonged to everyone who dared to walk it. It was humanity's first great experiment in global exchange. Trade helped cities rise and kingdoms fall. The prosperity of Silk Road trade could make a city bloom overnight. Oases like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar thrived as merchants poured wealth into their markets. Taxes on goods filled royal treasuries, funding grand architecture, armies, and cultural golden ages. But the same trade could also bring ruin. If routes shifted, cities once bustling with caravans were abandoned, left to crumble into sand. Kingdoms that taxed too heavily or failed to protect merchants saw traders bypass them for safer, friendlier routes. The ebb and flow of commerce became as decisive as war in determining the fate of empires. Trade was the lifeblood of these civilizations, and the Silk Road was its artery. Those who nurtured it thrived, those who neglected it withered. The ruins scattered across Central Asia are silent witnesses to fortunes that rose and fell with the rhythm of trade. Taxes on Silk Road goods funded empires. Every bolt of silk, every bag of spice, and every sack of silver that crossed the Silk Road was taxed. Rulers understood that trade meant wealth, and they built tax stations along key routes. In bustling cities like Samarkand or Chang'an, customs officers inspected caravans and collected duties, often demanding a portion of the goods themselves. These taxes filled imperial treasuries, funding armies, palaces, and monumental architecture. Sometimes they even paid for the very roads and caravanserais that kept trade flowing. Merchants grumbled, but they also relied on the stability that taxes helped maintain. In this way, every marketplace was tied to the machinery of empire. A silk robe in Rome or a porcelain cup in Persia was not only a luxury, but also a contribution to the prosperity of distant rulers. The Silk Road was as much about politics and revenue as it was about exchange. Highway robbery was always a threat. While the Silk Road conjures images of wealth and discovery, it was also fraught with danger. Bandits haunted its deserts and mountain passes, preying on isolated caravans. Ambushes could strip merchants of their fortunes in moments, and some routes became infamous for their lawlessness. Traders often traveled in large groups with armed guards to deter attack. Still, robbery was so common that stories of bandits became part of Silk Road folklore. Sometimes, entire tribes made their living from raiding, forcing rulers to either crush them or pay them off. For merchants, robbery was a constant reminder of the risks of long-distance trade. Each successful journey was a triumph over not only distance and climate, but also human greed. The glitter of silk and jewels always attracted shadows, and every merchant knew that the road to fortune passed through danger. Some caravans traveled with hundreds of guards. To protect against robbers, merchants sometimes hired entire companies of guards. A great caravan could number hundreds of people: traders, camel drivers, servants, and armed escorts. Soldiers marched alongside camels laden with treasures, their armor gleaming under the desert sun. Bows, swords, and spears ensured that if bandits struck, they would face fierce resistance. Wealthy merchants even pooled resources to afford professional guards, turning caravans into moving fortresses. These guards were not only muscle, they also guided caravans through hostile terrain, knew where bandits lurked, and negotiated safe passage with local tribes. Their presence was essential, for without protection, few merchants would risk the long journey. A caravan with hundreds of guards was a rolling city of wealth and power, a moving testament to the stakes of Silk Road commerce. Each step forward was secured by steel and determination. Silk Road pirates roamed the desert. We often think of pirates as prowling the seas, but the Silk Road had its own pirates, desert raiders who preyed on caravans like corsairs' hunting ships. These mounted bandits knew every dune, every canyon, and every oasis where travelers might be caught off guard. Swift horsemen could swoop down on a caravan, steal goods, and vanish into the sands before guards regrouped. Their attacks were so frequent that merchants sometimes called them pirates of the desert. Like their maritime counterparts, they formed networks, shared loot, and sometimes even traded stolen goods back into legitimate markets. Their existence highlights how fragile Silk Road trade could be. The wealth of empires depended on fragile strings of safety stretched across vast wildernesses, strings constantly threatened by raiders who knew the terrain better than anyone. In the silence of the desert, every shadow might hide a pirate waiting for treasure. The Great Wall of China helped protect trade routes. The Great Wall, stretching across China's northern frontier, was not only a military defense, but also a safeguard for Silk Road trade. Built and rebuilt over centuries, it stood as a barrier against nomadic raiders who threatened caravans leaving Chinese cities. Watchtowers dotted the landscape, their fires sending signals of approaching danger. Troops stationed along the wall patrolled nearby trade routes, giving merchants a measure of security. But the wall was more than stone and mortar. It symbolized the empire's determination to protect its lifeline of commerce. Each brick laid helped secure the flow of silk, jade, and porcelain outward, and the inflow of silver, horses, and ideas. Without the Great Wall, Chinese goods might never have reached distant markets with such reliability. Its vast, enduring presence is a reminder that the Silk Road was as much about protection as it was about passage. Some desert forts survive to this day. Scattered along ancient routes are the ruins of forts built to guard merchants. Rising like lonely sentinels in the desert, these strongholds offered refuge from bandits and storms. Garrisoned with soldiers, they served as both safe houses and checkpoints, where caravans could rest, pay tolls, and prepare for the next leg of the journey. Some forts were small outposts, others grew into towns, their walls ringing with the chatter of markets and the clatter of hooves. Astonishingly, many still stand today, their weathered stones echoing with silence where once merchants and guards bustled. Travelers who stumble across them feel the weight of history in their crumbling walls. These forts are reminders that trade was never easy. It was won through vigilance and protection, with walls and towers standing watch over humanity's greatest highway. Silk was smuggled out of China by monks. For centuries, China guarded the secret of silk making fiercely. Yet no monopoly lasts forever. According to legend, 2 Byzantine monks smuggled silkworm eggs out of China in the 6th century, hiding them inside hollow bamboo staffs. With this secret, Byzantium could finally produce its own silk, breaking China's centuries-old stranglehold. The story has the flavor of espionage, as though silk were not a fabric but a weapon. And in a sense, it was. Whoever controlled silk controlled immense wealth. The smuggling of silkworms shows how high the stakes of Silk Road trade could be. It was not only merchants risking deserts and bandits, it was also spies, monks, and envoys daring to steal the secrets of empires. From that moment on, silk was no longer China's alone, and the world's fabric industry was forever changed. Byzantine emperors finally learned the secret of silk. After the silkworms were smuggled into Byzantium, silk production took root in the Mediterranean. For Byzantine emperors, this was nothing short of revolutionary. No longer dependent on costly imports, they could produce their own silk for court ceremonies, church vestments, and diplomacy. Byzantine silk soon became a coveted export, rivaling Chinese fabric in luxury and prestige. Golden threaded robes shimmered in the Hagia Sophia, while silken banners fluttered in imperial processions. The empire's wealth grew, and silk became both a symbol of divine favor and political power. Yet even as Byzantium rose, China's silk remained unmatched in quality, ensuring that caravans still rolled eastward. The story of Byzantine silk reminds us that the Silk Road was not just about buying and selling. It was about knowledge, technology, and the relentless human drive to replicate and innovate. Silk changed the course of European fashion forever. When silk reached Europe, it sparked a revolution in clothing. Before, garments were largely wool, linen, or coarse cloth. Silk, with its shimmering texture and vivid dyes, transformed wardrobes. Nobles and royalty competed to display their wealth through elaborate silken robes, and fashion itself became a battlefield of prestige. Entire economies shifted as silk weaving centers sprang up in places like Italy and Spain, employing thousands of artisans. The craving for silk influenced trade policy, alliances, and even exploration, as Europeans sought direct access to its source. In many ways, the entire age of exploration, Columbus, Vasco da Gama, Magellan, was fueled by Europe's hunger for luxuries like silk. A single fabric helped reshape economies, societies, and even global maps. To wear silk was not merely to dress well, it was to wear the history of centuries of trade and desire. Marco Polo wrote about cities with 1 million inhabitants. In his travels, Marco Polo described cities in China that astonished European readers. He spoke of Hangzhou and Kongbalik Beijing, where populations numbered in the hundreds of thousands or even 1 million. To Europeans used to towns of a few thousand, such cities seemed like fantasy. Polo marveled at markets bursting with goods, bridges spanning wide rivers, and fleets of ships larger than any in Europe. His accounts painted Asia as a place of unimaginable wealth and sophistication. Though some contemporaries doubted him, archaeology later confirmed much of what he described. Polo's tales reshaped Europe's view of the world, showing that beyond the horizon lay civilizations grander than anything they had known. His descriptions of million-strong cities were not exaggerations. They were glimpses of a global scale that Europe had yet to dream of. Some thought his stories were pure fantasy. When Marco Polo returned to Venice, many dismissed his tales as fanciful exaggerations. Cities of 1 million? Paper money? Coal burning as fuel? These claims sounded too incredible to be true. Critics nicknamed his book The Million, implying he filled it with 1 million lies. Yet Polo maintained he had told only what he had seen. His credibility was doubted for centuries, with scholars arguing over whether he had even reached China. Still, whether or not every detail was true, his book captured imaginations. It pushed Europeans to dream of reaching Asia, whether by land or sea. Polo's so-called fantasies became maps for explorers. In the end, his skeptics mattered less than the generations of readers inspired by his words. The debate over truth and embellishment itself reflects the Silk Road's aura, a place where reality and legend blurred into one. Yet archaeology has proven many true. For centuries, skeptics doubted Marco Polo's accounts. Yet modern archaeology has confirmed many of his observations. He described paper money, once ridiculed by Europeans, which we now know was widely used in Yuan China. He mentioned coal being burned for heat, a practice unknown in Europe at the time, but confirmed by evidence in Chinese history. His accounts of cities, canals, and palaces often match archaeological remains. Even small details, like the use of salt for currency in certain regions, have been corroborated. Though he may have embellished in places, his writings remain among the most valuable records of Silk Road life. Archaeology has shown that behind his tales lay a core of truth, filtered through the wonder of a Venetian merchant seeing a world far beyond his own. Marco Polo's fantasies were, in many ways, glimpses of reality ahead of their time. The Silk Road brought gunpowder to Europe. China's invention of gunpowder traveled westward along the Silk Road, changing the face of warfare. At first used for fireworks, it evolved into bombs, rockets, and firearms. By the 13th century, gunpowder technology reached the Middle East and Europe. Castles that had stood for centuries crumbled under cannon fire. The armored knight, once the symbol of medieval might, became obsolete in the age of gunpowder weapons. The Silk Road carried not only beauty but also destruction, transmitting tools of power that redefined empires. Gunpowder is a reminder that trade can spread wonders and terrors alike. A formula born from Chinese alchemists' experiments reshaped the globe, turning the balance of power upside down. The echo of every cannon in Europe carries within it the silent journey of knowledge that began in distant Chinese workshops, carried across deserts and mountains to forever change the world. It also brought paper that changed the world. Paper, invented in China, may be the single most transformative commodity to travel the Silk Road. Before it spread, writing relied on parchment, papyrus, or costly vellum. Paper was lighter, cheaper, and easier to produce. Captured Chinese papermakers introduced the craft to the Islamic world after the Battle of Talas in 751 CE. From there, paper mills flourished in Samarkand, Baghdad, and Cairo, eventually reaching Europe. The result was an explosion of literacy, scholarship, and record-keeping. Without paper, libraries, universities, and bureaucracies would never have grown as they did. The Silk Road's caravans carried reams of this humble invention, shaping civilizations as profoundly as any jewel or spice. Every book we read today is part of that legacy, a descendant of paper's long journey across Asia. Its story proves that sometimes the simplest goods are the most world-changing. The printing press wouldn't exist without Silk Road paper. Johannes Gutenberg's printing press is often hailed as the invention that transformed Europe, spreading books and knowledge like never before. But the press required paper, and paper was a Silk Road gift. Without its arrival, Europe might still have relied on expensive parchment, limiting printing's reach. The abundance of paper made mass production possible, fueling the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the scientific revolution. Every printed page carried not only ink and ideas, but also the memory of caravans that once carried paper from China to Persia, from Persia to Europe. The printing press may have been a European invention, but its foundation was laid by Silk Road exchange. In this sense, the rebirth of Europe was also the triumph of Asia's inventions. Paper's long journey is one of the greatest examples of how a single commodity can shift the destiny of the entire world. The first world maps were inspired by Silk Road knowledge. Before the Silk Road, no one civilization possessed a true map of the world. Each region knew its neighbors, but the wider globe was a mystery. Through centuries of trade, knowledge of geography flowed as steadily as silk and spices. Merchants described distant lands, pilgrims recorded routes, and scholars compiled information. By the time of the Mongol Empire, maps began to reflect this global exchange. Islamic cartographers created some of the most advanced maps of the medieval world, blending Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese sources. These maps, filled with rivers, mountains, and trade routes, inspired European explorers. The idea of a world connected, even if imperfectly drawn, came from the conversations, reports, and notes carried along the Silk Road. Every ancient map is not only ink on parchment, but also the distilled knowledge of thousands of merchants who walked the world's greatest highway. Travelers used stars and landmarks to navigate. In the vast deserts and endless steppes of the Silk Road, maps were often useless. Instead, travelers relied on the stars above and the land around them. Caravans moved by night, when the North Star pointed the way and constellations marked the seasons. By day, they searched for natural landmarks, a lone hill rising above the sands, a line of trees hinting at hidden water, or even the bleached bones of earlier travelers. Skilled guides, often nomads who knew the land intimately, were invaluable. They could read the wind, the sand, and the patterns of bird flight to sense where oases lay. For merchants, navigation was not science, but survival, a fragile thread of knowledge passed down from guide to guide. In a world without compasses or GPS, each successful crossing was a triumph of memory, observation, and trust in the sky. Desert caravans relied on hidden wells. The lifeblood of desert trade was water. Without it, no caravan could survive. Across the Silk Road's harshest stretches, wells were dug deep into the earth, some known only to local tribes or passed along as guarded secrets. These hidden wells determined the very routes of the caravans. A mistake in calculation could mean disaster, camels collapsing, merchants perishing, goods left to the sands. Sometimes, wells were fortified by rulers, who charged tolls for their use. Other times, they were left unmarked, remembered only in the oral maps of nomadic guides. Archaeologists today still discover ancient wells, some lined with stone and wood, evidence of their importance. These small, unassuming openings in the earth were as valuable as any palace, for they kept life moving through the desert. Every sip of water taken by a caravan was a victory against the emptiness of the land. Oases became cultural melting pots. In the middle of endless deserts, oases shimmered like jewels. These green islands of water and palm trees were not just lifelines for caravans, they were crossroads of civilizations. Towns sprang up around them, markets bustled with goods, and temples and mosques rose beside gardens. At an oasis, a Persian merchant might trade stories with a Chinese scholar, while a Turkic nomad sold horses to an Indian traveler. Languages mixed as easily as spices, and new cuisines, fashions, and ideas blossomed in the mingling. The most famous oasis towns, like Kashgar and Dunhuan, became legendary for their cosmopolitan nature. Their walls were painted with foreign art, their bazaars rang with a dozen tongues, and their libraries preserved the wisdom of many lands. Oases show how geography creates culture. Where there was water, there was life, and where there was life, there was connection. Silk Road cities had markets bigger than modern malls. The markets of great Silk Road cities were spectacles that rival anything we know today. Imagine vast bazaars stretching for blocks, covered with awnings, filled with stalls selling silks, spices, gems, glassware, paper, and perfumes. The air was thick with incense, the clamor of bargaining, and the laughter of entertainers. In Samarkand, visitors described markets so large that each district specialized in a single type of good, one for textiles, one for horses, one for spices, one for metalwork. Marco Polo himself marveled at markets where thousands of merchants gathered each day, creating a living map of the world's wealth. Compared to modern shopping malls, these bazaars were more chaotic, but also more dazzling, a place where you could find goods from continents away and witness cultures colliding. Each market was a universe, and every purchase was part of a global story. Entire neighborhoods were devoted to foreign merchants. Many Silk Road cities developed special quarters reserved for foreign traders. In Chang'an, the great capital of China's Tang dynasty, whole neighborhoods were filled with Persian, Sogdian, Arab, and Indian merchants. They lived together, practiced their faiths, and brought their own customs and cuisines. Walking through such a district might feel like traveling through the world in miniature. Bazaars filled with exotic spices, temples to unfamiliar gods, conversations in languages from distant lands. These quarters were more than just accommodations. They were incubators of cultural exchange. Foreigners taught locals new crafts, introduced new foods, and left behind traces of their traditions in art and architecture. For centuries, the presence of these neighborhoods reminded city dwellers that they lived in a world much larger than their own empire. They were proof that the Silk Road was not just a line on a map, but a living, breathing web of humanity. Exotic perfumes were among the most prized goods. Perfume was one of the most coveted luxuries to travel the Silk Road. Fragrant resins, oils, and powders made their way from Arabia, India, and beyond into the palaces of Persia, China, and Europe. Frankincense, sandalwood, myrrh, musk, and rose oil were prized not only for their beauty, but also for their association with spirituality and healing. In temples, the smoke of incense was believed to carry prayers to heaven. In palaces, perfumes became markers of sophistication and wealth. Perfume sellers were common in the great bazaars, their stalls filled with shimmering bottles and fragrant powders. These scents connected worlds, a Chinese noble wearing Arabian musk, or a Persian queen perfuming her chamber with Indian sandalwood. In many ways, perfumes were invisible ambassadors of the Silk Road, carried in the air itself, weaving together continents with the power of scent. Frankincense and myrrh traveled thousands of miles. Frankincense and myrrh, both aromatic resins harvested from trees in Arabia and East Africa, were treasures of the ancient world. Their demand was insatiable. Temples burned them in offerings. Doctors prescribed them for ailments, and rulers adored them as symbols of luxury. Along the Silk Road, caravans carried sacks of the precious resins thousands of miles, passing through Persia into India and China. The journey was arduous. Hot deserts, dangerous bandits, and fragile goods that had to be carefully packed. Yet their value made the risk worthwhile. In China, frankincense was used in Buddhist rituals, while in Rome, myrrh was worth more than its weight in gold. These humble tree saps reveal how even natural products from small, remote regions could shape global trade. The sweet smoke rising in temples across continents was a direct echo of caravans trudging through the desert sands. Music instruments like the lute spread across the roads. The Silk Road was not silent. It carried music in the form of instruments that traveled as eagerly as spices and silks. The Persian oud, with its pear-shaped body and deep tones, journeyed eastward and inspired the Chinese pipa. Central Asian lutes influenced the Indian sitar and eventually the European lute. Flutes, drums, and harps all moved along the routes, blending traditions. A musician in Samarkand might play a tune that echoed Greek melodies, Persian rhythms, and Chinese ornamentation all at once. These instruments became passports for sound, spreading not only entertainment, but also cultural identity. In this way, the Silk Road didn't just carry goods, it carried the very notes and harmonies that defined civilizations. Every plucked string or blown flute was part of a vast symphony connecting the world. The music of today still carries faint echoes of those ancient crossings. The guitar's ancestors came from the Silk Road. Few realize that the modern guitar has ancestors that once traveled the Silk Road. The Persian oud and Central Asian lutes moved westward, evolving into the Arabic letter 2bf Omicron D, which then influenced the European lute. Over the centuries, this instrument transformed in shape and sound, eventually giving rise to the guitar we know today. In a sense, every modern guitarist is strumming the memory of Silk Road exchange. From flamenco in Spain to classical concert halls, The guitar's voice is a legacy of journeys across deserts and seas. The spread of stringed instruments shows how culture evolves. An idea born in one region adapts, changes, and re-emerges in new forms elsewhere. The guitar's lineage proves that even the music we enjoy today is part of the Silk Road's heritage, a reminder that human creativity has always traveled far, carrying sound from one culture to another. Silk Road wealth helped build Venice. Venice, that shimmering city on the water, owes much of its wealth to the Silk Road. Positioned at the edge of Europe, Venetian merchants became masters of importing luxuries from the East: silks, spices, gems, and glassware. They purchased goods from Middle Eastern traders, who had in turn received them from caravans arriving from Asia. Venice's power and architecture were funded by this flow of wealth. St. Mark's Basilica gleams with mosaics made possible by Eastern trade, while Venetian glassmakers learned techniques passed down from the Silk Road. Venetian ships became the seaborne continuation of the land routes, ensuring that the city grew into one of the richest and most cosmopolitan powers of the medieval world. Every gondola gliding across its canals carries, in some way, the legacy of the Silk Road's treasures. Without it, Venice might never have risen from lagoon to empire. Genoa also rose thanks to Eastern trade. Venice's great rival, Genoa, was also enriched by Silk Road commerce. Genoese merchants established networks across the Mediterranean, connecting with Middle Eastern ports that received goods from Asia. From there, they transported silks, spices, and gems into Europe, feeding the appetites of nobles and kings. Genoa's wealth funded powerful fleets, grand cathedrals, and palatial residences. It also financed exploration. Genoese sailors like Christopher Columbus grew up in this culture of trade and curiosity. In many ways, Genoa's rise shows how the Silk Road shaped Europe as much as Asia. The competition between Genoa and Venice was fueled by the flow of Eastern luxuries, proving that even distant deserts and mountains had the power to influence the politics of the Mediterranean. The fortunes of entire cities were tied to the caravans trudging thousands of miles away, unseen but essential. Arab dhows carried silk across the seas. While camels crossed the deserts, Arab sailors carried silk and spices across the waters. Their vessels, called dhows, were masterpieces of maritime design. Long, slender ships with triangular sails that could catch the slightest wind. Dhows connected India, Arabia, and East Africa with the broader Silk Road network. Laden with goods, they followed coastlines, stopping at bustling ports where markets teemed with treasures. On board, merchants spoke many languages, and their ships became floating bazaars. The sound of creaking timbers, the snap of sails, and the scent of spices made the dhows iconic symbols of trade. These ships reveal that the Silk Road was never just about land routes. It was also a maritime highway, with oceans as important as deserts. Each dhow slicing across the waves was a moving link in humanity's first global chain of commerce. The maritime Silk Road was just as important. Though we picture caravans winding across sand, the sea routes of the Silk Road were equally vital. Known as the Maritime Silk Road, these paths linked China with Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and East Africa. Ships carried porcelain, silk, and tea, returning with spices, ivory, gems, and exotic woods. Ports like Malacca, Calicut, and Aden became as important as Samarkand or Kashgar. Monsoon winds dictated the rhythms of travel, and sailors waited months for the right breezes to set sail. The seas were dangerous, but the rewards immense, faster, larger shipments than caravans could ever manage. In many ways, the Maritime Silk Road expanded the network's reach, tying together continents with sails and waves. It reminds us that the Silk Road was not one road at all, but a web that spanned both land and sea, binding the ancient world together. Indian Ocean monsoon winds powered global trade. The key to the maritime Silk Road was the rhythm of the Indian Ocean's monsoon winds. Each year, sailors timed their journeys to these predictable seasonal patterns, steady winds that carried ships eastward in summer and westward in winter. This natural cycle created the first global shipping lanes, allowing traders to cross vast oceans with remarkable efficiency. Ports from East Africa to India and China synchronized their markets to this rhythm, knowing exactly when fleets would arrive. Without the monsoons, the maritime trade system could never have flourished. They were, in a sense, invisible highways in the sky, connecting continents long before steamships or airplanes. Every bale of silk or sack of pepper that reached distant shores rode not only the wooden hull of a ship, but also the breath of the monsoon winds, carrying humanity's commerce across the world's oceans. The Silk Road was finally overtaken by sea routes. By the 15th and 16th centuries, the Silk Road began to decline. European explorers seeking direct access to Asia's riches found sea routes that bypassed the long, dangerous land journeys. Portuguese caravels rounded Africa, Spanish galleons crossed the Pacific, and new global trade routes emerged. Goods that once took years to cross deserts could now be shipped by sea in larger quantities. The rise of naval empires and colonial powers shifted the balance of world commerce. Caravans dwindled, cities like Samarkand faded, and the Silk Road's golden age ended. Yet its legacy endured. The very desire for silk and spices had driven exploration, reshaping the world map. Though the caravans grew silent, their memory lived on in the sails of ships and the discovery of new worlds. The Silk Road was not destroyed, it was transformed into something even larger, a truly global network. Yet its legacy lives on in modern highways. Today, parts of the old Silk Road are being reborn. Highways and railways trace the paths once taken by camels and caravans. Modern initiatives like China's Belt and Road echo the old dream of connecting East and West through commerce. In Central Asia, cities like Samarkand and Kashgar are once again celebrated as crossroads of culture. Tourists walk ancient streets where merchants once haggled over silk, while archaeologists uncover forgotten ruins along the trails. The Silk Road lives on not just in history books, but in modern geopolitics, trade, and imagination. Every highway truck that crosses Asia, every container ship that bridges continents, is in some sense a continuation of the Silk Road story. The world remains as connected as ever, still bound by the same desire to exchange goods, ideas, and culture. DNA studies show people mixed along the routes. Modern science has revealed what ancient travelers already knew. The Silk Road was a place where peoples mingled. Genetic studies of remains found along the routes show astonishing diversity. Central Asian skeletons with European traits, Chinese tombs with DNA from the Middle East, and even traces of Indian ancestry in steppe burials. These findings confirm that the Silk Road was not only about trade, but also about migration, marriage, and families forming across cultural boundaries. Every caravan carried not just goods but people, and those people left their mark in the human story. The faces along the Silk Road were not uniform, they were mosaics, blending features, traditions, and lineages. Today, the descendants of those mixtures still live across Eurasia, living proof of the road's power to bring humanity together. Ancient recipes still reflect Silk Road fusion. The Silk Road's legacy can still be tasted today. Many of the world's favorite dishes are products of centuries of fusion along its routes. Dumplings, for example, appear in Chinese, Central Asian, and Middle Eastern cuisines, each with local twists. Spices like cinnamon and pepper transformed European cooking, while rice and noodles traveled westward to influence Italian and Persian dishes. Even sweets carry echoes of the road. Baklava, halva, and filled pastries reflect a blending of techniques and flavors. In markets from Damascus to Xi'an, recipes traveled as easily as silk, passed down through kitchens and adapted by each culture. To eat today is to dine on the history of connection. Every bite of a spiced stew or sweet pastry is a taste of the Silk Road, a reminder that food has always been humanity's favorite way of sharing culture. Even today, new treasures are being unearthed. The Silk Road still surprises us. Archaeologists continue to discover lost cities buried in sand, mummies preserved in desert tombs, and caches of manuscripts hidden in caves. The Mogao caves at Dunhuang, for example, revealed thousands of scrolls sealed away for centuries, offering glimpses into the daily lives of traders and monks. Coins, jewelry, and pottery found in distant lands testify to journeys once thought impossible. Each discovery reshapes our understanding of the past, proving that the Silk Road was even more vast and vibrant than we imagined. In a way, the road still speaks, its sands and stones whispering forgotten stories. Every new find is not just history, but a reminder that the Silk Road is alive in the earth itself, waiting to be rediscovered. The Silk Road proved the world has always been connected. The greatest legacy of the Silk Road is the truth it reveals. The world has never been isolated. Long before airplanes and the internet, caravans and ships tied continents together in webs of trade, culture, and curiosity. The Silk Road showed that no empire stood alone, that every people was part of a greater human story. It was the first experiment in globalization, the first thread weaving humanity into a shared fabric. We still live in its shadow, drinking tea, wearing silk, strumming guitars, and reading books made possible by its exchanges. To study the Silk Road is to realize that our connections are ancient, that the world has always been one vast, intertwined network. The Silk Road was not only a road of commerce, it was a road of humanity, proving that across deserts, seas, and centuries, we have always sought one another. And so, our long journey along the Silk Road comes to a close. From deserts where bones marked the path to glittering cities where markets rang with 1,000 voices, we have wandered through the echoes of one of history's greatest highways. We've seen how silk and spices changed empires, how paper and gunpowder reshaped knowledge and power, and how stories, songs, and even the food on our tables carry whispers of these ancient exchanges. The Silk Road was never just a line across a map. It was a living thread, woven by countless hands and countless footsteps. Every caravan that set out carried not just goods, but hopes, fears, and dreams. Every market stall was more than a place of trade. It was a place of encounter, where strangers became neighbors, and neighbors became family. As you drift now into sleep, you might imagine the quiet bells of a caravan moving under the stars. The desert is vast, the night cool and still, and the sky above stretches endlessly, the same sky that once guided merchants, monks, and travelers from one world into another. The road winds on, steady and unbroken, a path of connection that never truly ends. The Silk Road reminds us that the world has always been bound together, that every culture is part of a greater human story. And just as the caravans rested at their oases after long days of travel, so too may you rest now, carrying with you the gentle knowledge that we are all connected across time, across distance, across history itself. If you enjoyed this journey and would like to join us on more gentle adventures into the past, be sure to subscribe to the Sleepy History channel. There are always more stories to share, more wonders to uncover, and more quiet moments of awe waiting along the way. But for now, close your eyes Let your thoughts settle like sand after the wind, and allow yourself to drift softly into dreams. The road is quiet, the world is vast, and sleep is here to carry you gently forward. Good night.